played the perfect wife in public, but he caught me red-handed in the worst way possible. I thought I could play both sides. I could live a double life. But I soon found out that it is not possible to be a faithful, perfect wife and a wild, cheating woman at the same time. I won't tell you my name for obvious reasons, but I will tell you this. I was married to a man who loved me. He wasn't just good, he was amazing. He woke up every day and worked hard, and he came home to me with a smile. He took care of everything we needed, and I guess you could say we had the perfect life. At least that's what people on the outside saw. But I was not happy. I should have been, but I wasn't. I had this empty feeling inside me, like something was missing, though I couldn't explain it. My husband gave me everything, love, care, security, but it didn't feel like enough. I didn't feel like enough. Sometimes I wondered if something was wrong with me. How could I have this wonderful man, this perfect life, and still feel so hollow? It made no sense. I kept it to myself, though. I smiled when people said how lucky I was. I played my part like a good wife. But inside, I felt like I was floating in a world where nothing felt real. One day I went to a bar. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to escape, or maybe I wanted to feel something, anything. It wasn't the kind of place my husband would go to. He wasn't into loud music or crowded spaces. He liked peace, the kind you find at home. But I needed something louder. The bar was full of people talking and laughing. The air smelled like drinks and sweat. I sat at a table by myself, just watching everyone. That's when I saw them. A group of university students was sitting a few tables away. They looked so carefree, like they had no worries in the world. And then I saw him. He wasn't the loudest or the funniest in the group, but there was something about him that made me notice him right away. He had this way of sitting, this way of holding his glass, that made him look like he owned the room without even trying. I couldn't stop looking at him. I told myself to stop. I had no business staring at anyone, let alone someone who was clearly much younger than me. But my eyes kept going back to him. It felt like I couldn't help it. I was like a moth, and he was the flame. Then it happened. He looked at me. It wasn't a quick glance. It was a long, deliberate look. Our eyes met, and he smiled. It was like he knew exactly what he was doing to me. My heart started beating so fast that I thought it might jump out of my chest. I looked away, but then I looked back. He was still looking at me, and now he was smiling wider. I smiled back, even though I shouldn't have. I knew it was wrong, but it felt like I couldn't control myself. I felt alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. He leaned over to his friends and said something, and they laughed. I thought maybe they were laughing at me, but then he stood up. My stomach did a little flip when I realized he was walking toward me. I wanted to tell him to stop. I wanted to get up and leave before he reached me, but I stayed frozen in my seat, like I was stuck in a dream. When he sat down across from me, it felt like the whole room disappeared. He didn't waste any time. He didn't ask my name or tell me his. He just looked at me with those eyes that seemed to see right through me, and he said the words, "I want you." I didn't know what to say when he said those words. It was like he had reached into my chest and pulled out all the things I had been hiding from the world. But instead of feeling exposed, I felt seen, like he understood something about me that no one else did. It was scary and exciting at the same time. I didn't just jump into his arms, though. I wasn't that kind of person, at least not yet. I laughed a little because I didn't know what else to do. I asked him for his name, trying to change the subject or maybe give myself some time to think. He said his name was Michael. Michael. It was a simple name, but when he said it, it felt like it carried weight. I said his name out loud, letting it roll off my tongue like it was something special. And then I told him I was older than him. I thought that would put a stop to whatever game he was playing. I wasn't some silly girl who could be swept off her feet by a younger guy with a charming smile. But he didn't care. He just smiled back at me like my words meant nothing. So I told him something else, something that should have made him back off. I told him I was married. I said it clearly, even showing him my wedding ring. My cheeks turned red as I said it, not because I was embarrassed about being married, but because I felt like I was lying somehow. Michael didn't flinch. He looked at my ring like it was just another piece of jewelry, like it didn't mean anything. And then he said something that made my heart skip a beat. He said my first excuse wasn't an excuse at all, and my second was a lie. I should have been offended. I should have told him to leave me alone. But instead, I laughed. I laughed because I didn't know what else to do. I laughed because deep down, I knew he was right. He kept talking, and the more he talked, the more I wanted to listen. He told me marriage wasn't just about wearing a ring or saying vows. It was a feeling, a state of mind. And if I didn't feel it, then it didn't count. I wanted to argue with him. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that my marriage was real, and it mattered. But I couldn't. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. How could he know that I felt hollow, like something was missing? How could he see that when I barely understood it myself? It was like he could read my mind. He told me I didn't feel fulfilled, and that's why my marriage didn't matter. He said it so casually, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. And the worst part was that I believed him. I didn't even try to stop myself from falling for him. I couldn't. He had this way of looking at me that made me feel alive, like I was the most important person in the room. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't care. When he looked at me, I felt like I wasn't just a wife or a good woman. I was someone who mattered, someone who could be seen and heard and understood. I hadn't felt that way in a long time, and I didn't want to let it go. I could feel myself smiling, even though I knew I shouldn't. I could feel my heart racing, even though I knew I was playing with fire. But I didn't care. For the first time in years, I felt alive. Michael didn't push me. He didn't try to touch me or make me do anything. He just sat there, looking at me with those eyes that seemed to see everything. And the more he looked, the more I felt like I couldn't hide from him. I knew I was doing something wrong. I knew I should have stood up and walked away, but I didn't. I stayed right there, letting him pull me deeper into a world I didn't understand but didn't want to leave. I told myself it was just a conversation. I told myself it didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I knew I was crossing a line I could never uncross. I tried to remind myself of my husband. I tried to picture his face, his smile, the way he looked at me when he said he loved me, but the image felt blurry, like it didn't belong to me anymore. All I could see was Michael. Michael was like a storm, and I was standing in the middle of it. I knew I should run for cover, but I couldn't move. I didn't want to move. He kept talking, and I kept listening. Every word he said felt like a hook, pulling me closer and closer, and the closer I got, the less I cared about anything else. I knew I was falling for him, and I didn't try to stop it. I didn't want to stop it. It felt too good, too real. For the first time in years, I didn't feel empty. I didn't feel like a ghost in my own life. Michael made me feel alive, and I didn't want to let that go, even if it meant losing everything else. A few weeks after that first night at the bar, I hadn't planned to see Michael again, but somehow, it just happened. One meeting turned into another, and before I knew it, we were meeting regularly. It felt natural, like slipping into a warm bath after a long, cold day. At first, all we did was talk. Our conversations were easy and exciting, the kind that made me forget about everything else. We'd talk about books, movies, dreams, and fears. He had this way of making me feel smart and interesting, like I mattered in a way I hadn't felt in years. I kept telling myself it was harmless. They were just words, just talks. Nothing had happened, not really. Michael and I hadn't crossed any big lines, so I told myself there was nothing wrong with what I was doing. I was just making a new friend, right? But deep down, I knew better. I knew I shouldn't have been spending time with him. I knew I shouldn't have been sneaking off to meet him after work, but I couldn't stop. My husband had no idea. He worked long hours and came home late, often tired from the day. He'd eat dinner, watch some TV, and go to bed. Our lives had fallen into this quiet routine, and I used that routine to hide what I was doing. I was a high school teacher, so I finished work earlier in the day. After school ended, I had hours of free time before my husband got home. Our daughter was in boarding school, so there was no one else to take care of. I had time, too much time, and I spent that time with Michael. I kept my perfect wife image intact. I made sure the house was clean, dinner was cooked, and everything looked normal. On the outside, I was still the same loyal, loving wife. But on the inside, I was someone else entirely. Every time I saw Michael, I felt more alive. It was like a switch had been flipped, and I couldn't turn it off. The hollow feeling I had carried for so long was gone, replaced by something electric and new. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. After all, nothing physical had happened. We were just talking, just spending time together. But I knew it was more than that. I could feel it in the way my heart raced when I saw him, in the way my hands shook when he smiled at me. One day we were sitting in a quiet cafe. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, and the room smelled like coffee and pastries. We were talking like we always did. I can't even remember what we were talking about because what happened next wiped everything else from my mind. As I was speaking, Michael leaned over and kissed me. It was sudden and unexpected, and it took my breath away. For a moment I couldn't think, couldn't move. All I could do was feel. When he pulled away, I sat there stunned. My heart was pounding and my face was hot. Butterflies filled my stomach, fluttering around like they had been waiting for this moment. I heard myself say one word. It was quiet and full of disbelief, but it came out before I could stop it. Wow. It was like my whole world stopped for a second, and all I could think about was him. He smiled at me after, like he was proud of himself, and asked if I liked it. I laughed because what kind of question was that? But instead of answering him right away, I decided to tease him a little. I told him to do it again so I could evaluate it properly. And he did. This time the kiss was deeper and slower, and it felt even better than the first. My heart was racing, and I felt this rush that I hadn't felt in years. When it was over, I smiled and told him it was a solid 10, and I meant it. I went home that evening feeling different. I couldn't stop smiling. Everything around me looked brighter, like the world had changed somehow. I felt filled with this new kind of happiness, and it was all because of him. I couldn't wait to see him again. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. The very next day, my daughter came home from boarding school for the holidays. I hadn't seen her in months, and I was happy to have her back. Don't get me wrong, I love my daughter. She's a bright, sweet girl, and I've always tried to be a good mom to her. But her being home made things complicated. I couldn't just slip away in the afternoons to see Michael like I had been doing. There were eyes on me now, little eyes that noticed everything. I tried to focus on her, I really did. I helped her unpack, and we spent time together catching up. She told me all about school and her friends, and I nodded and smiled in all the right places. But part of me wasn't really there. Part of me was thinking about Michael. It was hard. I wanted to see him so badly. After what had happened between us, it felt impossible to stay away. He had this pull on me, this way of making me feel alive and wanted, and I craved that feeling. Even my daughter noticed. One morning as we were eating breakfast, she looked at me and said I seemed happier. I almost choked on my coffee when she said it. She didn't mean anything by it, she was just making an observation. But it hit me like a punch to the gut. She was right, of course. I did feel happier. But it wasn't because of her or my husband or anything in my life that should have made me happy. It was because of Michael. I felt guilty for about a minute, and then I pushed the guilt aside because I didn't want to deal with it. Guilt was heavy and ugly, and I didn't have room for it in my perfect little world. I told myself I deserved to feel good, and Michael made me feel good. But now, with my daughter home, I had to be more careful. I couldn't just sneak out whenever I wanted. I had to plan things, think things through. It was frustrating, but I knew I had to do it if I wanted to keep seeing him. And I did want to keep seeing him more than anything. Anyways, my husband's birthday was coming up, and it was a big deal. I wanted everything to be perfect. I planned a party, made a guest list, and picked out his favorite foods. I spent hours making sure everything was just right. It kept me busy, too busy to meet Michael in person. But we still texted a lot. Every spare minute I had, I was glued to my phone, typing messages to him. He always knew the right thing to say to make me smile. Even when I was stressed out planning the party, Michael's texts made me feel better. The day of the party was a whirlwind. Family and friends filled the house. My daughter helped me set up decorations and arrange the cake. I wore my best dress, the one my husband loved, and I made sure my makeup was flawless. During the party, I was the perfect wife. I smiled, sang happy songs with everyone, and kissed my husband for all to see. I told him how much I loved him, and I meant it. I did love him, but at the same time, I loved Michael too. It sounds crazy, doesn't it? Loving two people at once. but that's how I felt. When the party was over and everyone had left, I was exhausted. My husband thanked me for the wonderful party, and I smiled like everything was normal. But inside, my mind was already drifting back to Michael. A few days after the party, my husband went back to work, and my daughter asked if she could go see some friends. I didn't even hesitate. I told her yes right away, as long as she promised to be home by 8. I was thrilled to have some time to myself, or more accurately, time to see Michael. The moment she left, I grabbed my keys and drove to his place. He had been asking me to come over for weeks, and now I finally had the chance. As I pulled into his driveway, I felt a mix of excitement and nerves. When he opened the door, he greeted me with a big smile and said something cheeky about his humble abode. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was cozy and felt like him. I stepped inside, feeling like I was stepping into a different world, a world that was just ours. That day at Michael's place, we talked for hours. He always knew how to make me laugh and feel good about myself. He told me stories about his life, his dreams, and what he wanted for the future. It was easy to lose track of time with him. He made me feel like I was the only person in the world who mattered. At some point, I mentioned how tired I'd been from all the running around for my husband's birthday party. Michael offered to give me a massage, and I didn't say no. He started with my shoulders, working out knots I didn't even know were there. Then he moved to my back and feet, and it felt so good I almost forgot where I was. But then, one thing led to another. The massage turned into something more, something I couldn't stop even if I wanted to. It was intense, and it was everything I didn't know I needed. I wish I could tell you that I regretted it, but I didn't, not even a little. I loved every second of it. But deep down there was this tiny voice in my head telling me I had crossed a line. I tried to ignore it, but it was there, nagging at me. Still, I left Michael's place feeling like I was on top of the world. I made it home just in time, before my daughter and husband came back. The next day, my daughter said she wanted to go to work with my husband. She liked spending time with him, and honestly, I was glad to have the house to myself. I used that time to see Michael again. This time we didn't waste any time talking. We picked up right where we left off the day before, and it was just as intense, if not more. Being with him made me feel things I hadn't felt in years. He made me feel alive. Afterward, as we lay there catching our breath, Michael asked if he could see me again the next day. I told him I'd try, but I wasn't sure how I would make it work. I knew I had to be careful. When I got home, my husband and daughter were already there. My husband had come home early, which surprised me. He seemed happy, though, and he told me there was going to be a staff dinner the next evening. He asked if I would come with him. Of course, being the perfect wife I pretended to be, I smiled and told him I'd be there. That day was hectic from the start. I woke up early to help my daughter with her breakfast and made sure my husband had everything he needed before he left for work. He was excited about the dinner, and I was doing my best to act like I was excited too. But my mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about Michael. He hadn't stopped texting me since the last time we met. He sent me sweet messages and little jokes that made me laugh. But he also made it clear he wanted to see me again. I told him I wasn't sure if I could come. My husband was coming home early, and my daughter was staying home all day. I didn't see how I could make it work, but deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. I didn't just want to see Michael. I needed to see him. He had this pull on me that I couldn't resist, no matter how wrong I knew it was. The day dragged on. My daughter was in the living room watching TV, and I was pretending to clean the house. Really, I was pacing around, trying to think of a way to sneak out without raising suspicion. It felt impossible. Michael texted me again, asking if I was coming. I stared at the message, my heart racing. I knew I should say no. I should stay home and be with my daughter, but I didn't want to. And then a terrible thought crossed my mind. I actually wished my daughter wasn't home. It was an awful thing to think, but it popped into my head anyway. I felt a pang of guilt, but it wasn't strong enough to stop me. I told my daughter that I needed to go to the store to buy something. I don't even know what I said I was going to get. She nodded and said okay, completely trusting me. She didn't even ask questions. I grabbed my purse and left the house, leaving her there alone. It was wrong, I knew it was wrong, but I did it anyway. I got to Michael's place in record time. My heart was racing, not just from excitement, but from the guilt bubbling in the back of my mind. But when he opened the door and smiled at me, all of that guilt seemed to disappear. I spent the afternoon at Michael's, and I don't know if it was the thrill of sneaking around or the fear of getting caught, but everything felt more intense. Every touch, every moment, it was like we were racing against time. I didn't even look at the clock. For a little while, I forgot about everything else. My husband, my daughter, the lies. I let myself sink into the feeling, and it was like nothing else mattered. But then, reality came crashing back. I remembered that I had left my daughter alone, and I had a dinner to attend with my husband. Panic set in as I grabbed my things and hurried out of Michael's apartment. He smiled at me like he wasn't worried about a thing, but I couldn't shake the guilt creeping up my spine. The drive home felt like forever, even though I was speeding. My heart was racing and my hands were shaky on the wheel. I kept replaying the afternoon in my head. It was like two parts of me were fighting, a part that loved the excitement and a part that hated myself for what I was doing. When I got home, my daughter was sitting in the living room, watching TV like nothing had happened. She looked up at me and asked if I had gotten what I went to buy. That's when it hit me. I hadn't bought anything. I froze for a second, trying to come up with an answer. I told her some silly excuse, something about the store being out of what I needed and that I'd go back later. She nodded and went back to watching her show, completely unaware that I had just lied to her. I went to my room and started getting ready for the dinner. My hands were still shaky as I did my makeup. I kept telling myself to calm down, that no one would know what I'd done. But the guilt was there, sitting heavy in my chest. My husband came home not long after. He was in a great mood, excited about the dinner. He kissed me on the cheek and asked if I was ready. I smiled at him, pretending like everything was fine. We walked out the door arm in arm, and for a moment, I almost convinced myself that I was still the perfect wife. The dinner that night was a success. I wore my best smile and stayed close to my husband the entire time. I laughed at all the right jokes, said all the right things, and made sure to talk about how wonderful my husband was. I painted this perfect picture of us, and everyone at the table seemed to admire him more because of it. People kept telling him how lucky he was to have a wife like me. A few of his colleagues even flirted with me in subtle ways, but I shut them down quickly and firmly. I didn't want anyone getting the wrong idea, and I certainly didn't want anything to ruin the image I had created. My husband's chest seemed to puff up with pride every time someone complimented us, and I felt like I had done my job well. The night ended with my husband wrapping his arm around me as we left the restaurant. He was beaming, and I felt a strange mix of emotions. On the surface, I looked like the perfect wife, but inside I was far from it. A few days later, the holidays were over, and it was time for my daughter to return to school. The morning was busy as we packed her things and got her ready to leave. My husband hugged her tightly before he left for work, and I could see the sadness in his eyes. He loved her so much, and it was hard for him to see her go. After he left, I drove her back to school. The goodbye was emotional, as always. She hugged me tightly and told me she loved me, and I told her the same. As I watched her walk away, my heart felt heavy. The drive back home was quiet. The house felt even quieter when I got there. The silence was almost unbearable, and I didn't know what to do with myself. I walked around the house aimlessly, trying to keep busy, but nothing worked. I felt alone, and sadness started creeping in. It wasn't just the emptiness of the house, it was everything. It was the weight of what I had been doing, the lies I had been telling, and the secrets I was keeping, including the fact that I missed my daughter, and I know that's ironic because I kept looking for a way to send her out or sneak out while she was home. Then, like clockwork, my thoughts went to Michael. He had this way of making everything feel exciting and new. He made me forget about the guilt, the lies, and the emptiness. He made me feel alive. Without thinking too much about it, I grabbed my phone and called him. I told him to come over, and he agreed immediately. Michael came over to my house that morning. He looked so happy when he stepped inside. I had never invited him over before, and I could tell he felt special, like this was something big. It felt big to me too, but for all the wrong reasons. Still, I pushed that thought aside. The moment he walked in, I hugged him tightly. It felt natural, like this was how it was meant to be. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, we were wrapped up in each other. It wasn't just a kiss or a hug this time. It was everything. We started in the living room, not caring about anything else. I didn't think about the couch where my family had sat together so many times. I didn't think about the memories tied to that room. It was all about Michael and how he made me feel. Eventually, we moved to the bedroom. Yes, my bedroom, my husband's and my matrimonial bed. It was wrong, but at that moment, it didn't feel wrong. I was so caught up in the excitement and the thrill that I couldn't even hear my conscience anymore. Afterward, we lay together in bed, his arms wrapped around me like everything was perfect. We laughed and talked about silly things, completely ignoring reality. He even made jokes about how nice my house was, and I laughed along, pretending that nothing about this was insane. The house felt different with him in it. It was like I had let him into a space that wasn't supposed to be his, and yet he fit in like he belonged there. We walked around freely, not even bothering to be careful. We didn't worry about who might see or what might happen if someone came home. I wasn't even thinking about my husband. I knew he was supposed to come back late that night, and that gave me all the confidence I needed. I had the whole day, or so I thought. Michael and I ended up on the couch in the living room, relaxed and happy. We were both in our underwear, sitting so close that it was almost like we were one person. The couch was familiar, but the scene playing out on it was anything but. We were talking about something trivial, laughing like this was the most natural thing in the world. The sunlight streamed through the windows, and everything felt so calm. It was the kind of calm that tricks you into thinking nothing could go wrong. But then it happened. The front door opened and my husband walked in. I froze. Michael froze. It was like the world had stopped spinning, and all the air in the room had disappeared. There he was, standing in the doorway, holding his bag, with two of his friends beside him. He had brought them home to have a drink with them, since he didn't want to go to a bar, and I bet he wished he went to the bar instead. His eyes widened as he took in the scene before him. His wife, sitting on the couch in her underwear, with another man right next to her, just as exposed. For a second, no one moved. No one spoke. It was like we were all trying to process what was happening, but the truth was right there in plain sight. My husband's face went pale, then red. His jaw tightened, and his hands clenched into fists. He didn't say a word, but the look in his eyes said everything. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say. I could see the embarrassment in his eyes, the shame. He looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him at that point. Hen just turned to his friends and asked them to leave. His tone was cold and commanding. They didn't even bother asking any questions or saying anything. They understood and just left. He looked at Michael and told him to get out of the house before something extreme happened. Michael looked at me like he wanted to be present for me, but with a scared face and voice, I pleaded with him to leave. I picked up his clothes and left. My husband shook his head, told me to get out as well, and walked upstairs. I may have broken my marriage. I don't know what to do. Please help me. Somebody help me. Update. It has been a few months since that awful day when my husband walked in and saw everything. My life has completely fallen apart, and I don't even know where to begin. Every day feels heavier than the last, and I can't seem to find my way out of this mess. After that day, he told me to leave. I begged him not to do it, falling to my knees and crying so hard I could barely breathe. I pleaded with him, telling him to think about our daughter. I begged him to let us figure it out, to give me another chance. I said I would change, that I'd do anything to make it right. But he wouldn't listen. He just looked at me like I was a stranger, someone he didn't recognize anymore. I tried to remind him of the good times we had, how much we loved each other, how happy we were before all of this, but it didn't matter. My words didn't reach him. He packed some of my things into bags and told me to go. Leaving the house felt like leaving my whole life behind. I couldn't imagine what it would be like for our daughter to come home and find me gone. I thought about how she would feel when she found out that her parents weren't together anymore. The thought of her walking into the house and seeing only her dad broke me inside. I cried so much those first few nights. My husband is now asking for a divorce. He has been firm about it, and no matter how much I try to talk to him, he doesn't change his mind. I keep begging him. I send him messages. I even call him sometimes, but he doesn't want to talk. He's done, and I know it, but I can't accept it. The regret eats at me every day. I can't stop thinking about what I've done. If I could go back and undo it all, I would. I would give anything to have my family back, to have my life back. But there's no undoing this. There's no fixing what I've broken. Michael has tried to be there for me, but honestly, I don't even want him around. Every time I see him or hear from him, it just reminds me of what I did and how much I've lost. He says he wants to help, but I feel nothing but anger and frustration when he's near. I can't even look at him without feeling sick. Rumors about what happened have spread everywhere, like wildfire. Everyone in town knows what I did, and they're not shy about judging me. The stares, the whispers, the gossip, it's constant and too much. I lost my job because of it. The parents at the school where I taught started complaining. They said they didn't feel comfortable having me teach their kids anymore. The principal called me in and told me it was best if I left. I didn't even fight it. What could I say? I thought maybe I could get a place nearby, so I'd still be close when my daughter came home for the holidays. But that didn't work out. Everywhere I went, people looked at me like I was the worst person in the world. Going to the grocery store became unbearable. I could feel their eyes on me, and I could hear their whispers. I ended up leaving town. I had to. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up what little I had left and went somewhere far away where no one knew me. It's quieter here, but the loneliness is suffocating. I sit in my small apartment and think about everything I've lost. My husband, my daughter, my job, my home, my reputation, it's all gone. And for what? For moments that I thought would make me happy, but only left me with regret. I wish I could take it all back. I wish I could undo every bad choice I made. But it's too late. The damage is done, and now I have to live with it.